translate into an omnicidal, civilization-ending nuclear exchange. Annie Jacobson's new book, Nuclear War Scenario, provides a chilling description of what could happen should deterrence fail, the end of all life as we know it in 72 minutes. UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres warns that we are at the knife's edge, with the risk of nuclear conflict, as he said, at the heights not seen since the Cold War. Think about that, the knife's edge. And the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist has repeated that humanity is 90 seconds from apocalypse. We need to take the absence of no first strike doctrines very seriously. Recent Russian nuclear threats remind us that nuclear deterrence theory doesn't guarantee that nuclear weapons cannot be used in war, launched preemptively, or sent off as a result of miscalculations or an accident. In the U.S., we have the tradition of threatening and preparing to initiate nuclear war to gain battlefield advantage or to ensure that no nation will intervene to protect a nation that we are determined to attack. Think Korea, Vietnam,
right now,
Iraq,
so you know.
Even Guatemala.
President
Putin used the same approach when he warned that he could resort to nuclear weapons were French or other NATO forces deployed to Ukraine. I'll add that in recent conversations with some fairly senior Russians, they've been clear that were Crimea to be threatened in terms of Russian control, all bets are off in terms of the possible Russian use of nuclear weapons. The popular understanding of nuclear deterrence is that no power will attack another nuclear weapon state with its nuclear arsenal unless it is attacked first. But who remembers that the initial draft of the Bush-Cheney doctrine for joint nuclear operations was clear, and I quote, "The focus of U.S. deterrence efforts is to influence potential adversaries to withhold actions intended to harm U.S. national interests. Our oil, for example, under their SAM. In the past, the U.S. has prepared and threatened to initiate nuclear war to ensure that Saddam Hussein didn't use chemical weapons on U.S. troops as they gathered to decimate his forces. The threat was made in response to Chinese shelling of offshore Taiwanese islands, and numerous times during wars and tensions with North Korea. There are numerous ways that deterrence can fail, among them systems failure, as when an early warning system misreads a flight of geese, when the wrong cassette is placed in a computer, when a nuclear power's bluff is called, or when a launch signal is mistakenly sent, as happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The truth is that if the human species, our friends, our children, our grandchildren, are to survive, we must debunk and overcome deterrence theory and practice, which serves as the foundation of the existential nuclear threat. Tonight we are privileged to have 4 excellent and renowned authorities to do just that. They will each speak for up to 10 minutes, and then Kevin will host our Q&A session. We'll begin with former Hiroshima Mayor Tadatoshi Akiba. Not content with his degrees in mathematics from Tokyo's elite Tokyo University and from MIT, and after teaching for years at Tufts University, Professor Akiba returned to Japan, where he served for a decade in Japan's parliament, and then went on to become Hiroshima's mayor from 1999 to 2011. As mayor, he became one of the world's leading advocates of nuclear weapons abolition, including launching the Hiroshima and Nagasaki-led Mayors for Peace, and he traveled the length and breadth of Japan and the world, warning of the nuclear dangers and pressing for meaningful disarmament diplomacy. One of my favorite memories is marching with him and 25,000 others in New York on the eve of the 2010 NPT Review Conference, demanding the full implementation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Tad, the forum, the page, the webinar here is yours. Take it away.
And they did not respond to any of them.
Okay, thank you very much, Joseph, and moderator Kevin, fellow panelists and fellow peace workers. Good morning from Japan. First, I'd like to remind ourselves that there is a hidden assumption we accept when we discuss world issues. And it is that leaders of the world, including those from nuclear weapon states, NWS for short, have minimal common sense. If this assumption loses its reality, we must choose a different approach altogether. Today, my original thought was to outline the 2040 vision, a revised version of Mayors for Peace's 2020 vision. However, I would focus on some of its components from the point of view of debunking deterrence theory. Another emphasis will be on Japan and Hiroshima. The deterrence theory is illogical, irrational, immoral, inhumane, and everything else. And as a witness, I offer Jacques Chirac, whom I met in the 1990s with Madame Doi. He told us that nuclear deterrence is logically false because no one can refute the following argument. If possessing nuclear weapons guarantees national security, all countries should acquire nuclear weapons. Witness number 2 is Prime Minister Theresa May. During the July 2016 parliamentary debate, the SNP's George Caravan asked her, "Are you prepared to authorize a nuclear strike that could kill hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children?" Prime Minister May replied with one word, "Yes." Then continued, "The whole point of deterrence is to let our enemies know that we would be prepared to use it." Prime Minister's firm resolve to use nuclear weapons must stem from her belief that the murder of 100,000 innocent enemy citizens would have an infinite weight in the minds of the enemies. At the same time, the same atrocity would be acceptable to her and her countrymen and women simply as an infinitesimal episode. Short of magic, one action causing two such contradictory reactions in people's minds is hard to swallow. Such a contradiction characterizes the deterrence theory. Going back in time to the 1980s, rationally minded people tried to show the world and its leaders what launching a nuclear war would entail by offering convincing predictions and the grave consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. A simplified list goes something like this. A, physicians would not be able to provide even minimal medicine for the victims after a nuclear strike. B, a massive exchange of megaton nuclear weapons between the United States and the Soviet Union would wipe out humanity. At the least, it would cause a nuclear winter and humanity would face imminent extinction. C, even the use of 100 or so Hiroshima-sized nuclear devices between India and Pakistan would create a nuclear famine that would starve 2 billion people to death in areas surrounding both countries and possibly in more expansive areas. I believe that the world's public and leaders understand these science-based effects on a global scale. As a result, deterrence theory now limits its scope to using only Hiroshima-sized or smaller nuclear weapons. That is why the 2016 British parliamentary discussion and President Putin's threat fall within this scope. Prime Minister May and President Putin also raised another critical point, the personal responsibility of the person pressing the button. President Putin's threat to use nuclear weapons, though most likely it was not his intention, made viewers of the evening news realize that there is a culprit to the atrocities they watch. Adding the angle of accountability makes our job of convincing nuclear weapon states and their leaders not to use even smaller sized nuclear devices more effective. To show them what they would be held accountable for, we need to remind them of the sufferings and inhumanities that the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings had caused. The moral dimension and accountability question also strengthen the TPNW's legal power. The heaviest burden is on the United States, the only country that had used nuclear weapons in war, as President Obama reminded the world, and Japan, the only country that knows the reality of nuclear war. However, they have been complicit in avoiding the issue of morality. In a simplified scenario, they both adhere to the myth that the sneaky attack on Pearl Harbor started the war and the righteous A-bombs ended it. This myth has successfully hidden the moral dimension of history from the public's eyes. Hidden are the war responsibility of Emperor Hirohito and the morality of atomic bombings. A recent sister park agreement between the Pearl Harbor National Memorial Park and Hiroshima Peace Park, which was forced on the citizens of Hiroshima suddenly, is an example of the two governments not forgetting the hidden agenda. Now let me concentrate on Japan. Japan has been a docile servant to the U.S. nuclear policy and an active blocker of the U.S. policy change. Here are a few examples. A. In July 2017, the Japanese ambassador to the United Nations declared before anyone else that it would neither sign nor ratify TPNW. The Japanese government thus sent a clear signal to all nuclear weapon states and dependent states that it was okay to oppose the abolition of nuclear weapons. It is the moral stamp of approval from the only able country in history. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe bluntly told the Obama administration that he opposed the idea of no first use being considered by Obama in 2016. The G7 summit in Hiroshima adopted the final document, the Hiroshima Vision. It endorsed deterrence theory. For many innocent people, the name Hiroshima is now an official endorser of deterrence theory. Instead, what if Prime Minister Kishida, who calls himself the Prime Minister from Hiroshima, flew to Moscow to persuade President Putin to declare he will not use nuclear weapons, or invited him as a special guest to Hiroshima to show him the Avon Museum? Ditto to Prime Minister Netanyahu. The spirit of Hiroshima, together with the city's solid and stable stance, long influenced the government's persistent pro-nuclear weapons attitude. Unfortunately, in recent years, this role Hiroshima has played so effectively has eroded considerably. Here are a few examples. A. From 2011 to the present, Mayor Matsui of Hiroshima appointed ex-foreign ministry officials as the head of the Peace Culture Foundation. The foundation is responsible for formulating and executing Hiroshima City's peace policy, including drafting the peace declaration. Historically, retired anti-nuclear journalists or active peace workers held the position. In 2023, the city's Board of Education deleted Barefoot Gen, a famous cartoon by Hibakusha cartoonist, from its peace reader. The Peace Declaration of 2023 last year embraced the Hiroshima Vision's central concept, the deterrence theory. Still, it also announced that the deterrence theory is bankrupt because some world leaders threatened to use these weapons. Again, what if the city of Hiroshima invited President Putin to Hiroshima or went to Moscow to persuade him, even if the Prime Minister is unwilling to do so? Finally, there are some optimistic signs. With the Labour Party in control, Scotland will likely propose gaining independence from Great Britain to become a non-nuclear weapons country. Also in Japan, since the Kishida administration seems desperate enough to try anything to raise its popularity, given enough pressure, he may request his cabinet members to visit Hiroshima and Nagasaki for the first time to learn about the Hibakusha's experiences and messages. As you saw, there is a vast gap between what Japan and Hiroshima could and should do and the harsh reality I just reported. We are working toward launching a new and realistic plan to fill that gap on August 6 next year, the 80th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Please help us accomplish this goal. Oh, thank you very much.
Mayor Akiba, thank you very much. I think most people here in the United States have very little understanding of the role of the Japanese government in really reinforcing U.S. preparations for nuclear war and in really misrepresenting the lessons of the A bombings. And I look forward to the questions that we'll have for you that our many participants have. I'm looking here at the number 287 people at the moment. Let me then turn to Elaine Scarry. Elaine teaches at Harvard University, where she is the Cabot Professor of Aesthetics. Among her works is Thermonuclear Monarchy, which demonstrates that nuclear weapons and democratic governance are mutually exclusive. Beyond demonstrating the extraordinary dangers of first-strike nuclear doctrines, and that the 9 nuclear monarchs hold the fate of humanity in their hands, she also maintains that they have the political tools needed to dismantle their country's nuclear architecture, and they also have the obligation to do so. Elaine has been elected to the American Philosophical Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She has received numerous honors and awards and was named as one of the top 100 leading U.S. intellectuals. No captive of the Ivory Tower, Elaine serves on the board of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, and she is very active with the Massachusetts Peace Action's Nuclear Disarmament Working Group. Elaine, thank you for all that you do, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Kevin, and fellow speakers, and to all of you who are participating. I want tonight to devote my 10 minutes to just describing the response to deterrence by General Lee Butler, who, as you probably know, is the former Commander-in-Chief of the United States Strategic Command. In addition to being Commander-in-Chief of the United States Strategic Command, General Butler was director of the Joint Strategic Target Planning Staff. So his voice is one that's coming to us from the deep interior of our country's nuclear architecture. For example, in the year the Berlin Wall fell, his particular job was to serve as Director for Strategic Planning in the Office of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So this is somebody who could be crowing about his success in overseeing nuclear deterrence. And instead, what he gives us is an impassioned denunciation of deterrence theory. General Butler says that deterrence, nuclear deterrence, is premised on a litany of unwarranted assumptions, unprovable assertions, and logical contradictions. He identifies, as I see it, 8 flaws in the mindset of deterrence. Number 1 is the fact that deterrence contradicts the first obligation of the military and the first obligation of national security, which is to ensure the survival of the nation. He doesn't just say that they don't live up to that. He says that they starkly contradict it. It leads him to say that it's our greatest responsibility to rethink nuclear deterrence. The second flaw is the fact that nuclear deterrence is fatally flawed on the level of human psychology. He says that it's premised on the idea that each side can understand the position of the others, and yet in reality, each has very little understanding and in many cases makes very little even attempt to understand what the other side is doing and saying. He deplores the fact that we take Western reasoning and rationality as a model for a situation that is hideously complex and terrifying and gives rise to all kinds of panic and fear. Now, it's the case that one of the leading proponents of nuclear deterrence theory, Thomas Schelling, points out that deterrence is often wrongly accused, in his view, wrongly accused of being hyper-rational. And yet, when you listen to Thomas Schelling's often very brilliant interviews on YouTube, you see that each time somebody presents him with a scenario that could entail the breakdown of deterrence theory, he says, but that would be foolish, or, but that would mean that people had misperceived one another. And yet that's exactly what happens in the fog of war. People do misconstrue others' intentions. Number 3 in General Butler's denunciation is a flaw in deterrence theory that comes from the fact that if it fails, the consequences of that failure are intolerable. General Butler says that in conventional war, if deterrence fails, you will, of course, suffer. You may lose a battle, you may lose the war, you may have your country change governance, but you don't have what you have if deterrence fails, and that is that the whole earth, he says, is poisoned, and inhabitants are deformed from generation to generation. Not only the fate of nations, but the very meaning of civilization, he writes, are in jeopardy. I think that his point here is very clarified by an observation made by a sociologist at Yale named Charles Perrow, who points out that every device, every object, every process in the world has some moment in which it will break down, even if only for a short time. And therefore, what you don't want is any object or any device or any process that in the event that it breaks down is going to be catastrophic. And exactly what nuclear deterrence is a process that if it breaks down is going to be utterly fatal. The fourth flaw in the in deterrence theory is the fact that there's a tremendous contradiction at its heart. General Butler says that deterrence relies on the specter of a huge second strike. If my opponent wants to use a first strike against me, he will be discouraged when he sees that even after that strike, I have an arsenal that can deliver massive retaliation, or at least retaliation far beyond what was suffered. But here is the contradiction. To my opponent, this mighty second strike arsenal that I've amassed looks an awful lot like a first strike arsenal. And fearing that I might deliver a massive first strike, my opponent now has to vastly increase their own second strike arsenal, which looks to me like a first strike arsenal. And so the very point of deterrence, which was to dissuade people from first use by showing the strength of second use, turns over in a somersault and just gravitates once more towards first use. It also has another consequence, which leads directly to the fifth flaw, and that is that it accelerates, it increases the composition of US and Soviet forces and the forces of other nuclear states. That is, rather than placing rational limits on nuclear forces, it gives rise to an insatiable arms race. Now, General Butler repeatedly calls out the greed and obscene appetite of weapons contractors, and he also remarks on the competition between Navy and Air Force for which one will get to be preeminent in the nuclear array. He also shows that what proliferates are bureaucracies and processes. He writes that there are astronomically expensive infrastructures, monolithic bureaucracies, and complex processes which just defy one's comprehension. To enhance rather than constrain application is the outcome of nuclear deterrence. And he says that as he witnessed weapon after weapon being contemplated through every corridor, and now I'm quoting, through every corridor, in every impassioned plea, in every fevered debate about a given weapon, rang the rallying cry, deterrence, deterrence, deterrence. So the drive for new weapons, again, comes from greed, comes from competition, comes from the wish to create ever more ingenious forms of massacre, but it also comes from that paradox between first use and second use that I described earlier. The sixth flaw is the profound moral aberration of deterrence. General Butler points out that it can't possibly be legitimate and appropriate to respond to a nuclear weapon by then launching a nuclear weapon at the opponent's population. What target, he writes, could warrant such retaliation? Would we hold an entire society accountable for the decision of a single demented leader? Closely related to this sixth flaw is a seventh flaw. Deterrence destroys the ability of both individuals and groups to think clearly. He says that deterrence theory and game theory are made up of rhetorical parlor tricks and verbal sleights of hand that disable our ability to think. They corrode our sense of humanity, numb our capacity for moral outrage, and make thinkable the unimaginable. That's their effect on individuals who keep bandying the term deterrence about. But it also harms planners who should be using their mental abilities to scrutinize situations, to debate, to deliberate, and instead are in this, what one philosopher describes as tit-for-tat game of deterrence. The eighth flaw is the one that Tad mentioned at the very opening of his talk, namely deterrence theory promotes proliferation internationally. If we think deterrence makes the world safer, then many other countries should adopt it as well. General Butler says, while we continue to espouse nuclear deterrence and to celebrate it as an irreplaceable element in our security, other nations are listening and are being converted to our theology. So General Butler describes deterrence as a framework that prepares the way for apocalypse. It must be challenged, it must be refuted, he says, but most important, it must be let go. Thank you.
Elaine, thank you. Thank you so much for that. I find myself looking forward to having the written texts that we can not only distribute to people here, but to be posting so that they can do their work more broadly in the world. Let me now turn to introduce my friend and longtime colleague, Jackie Cavasso, who has served since 1984 as the Executive Director of the Western States Legal Foundation.
You are not allowed.
Also, she served as the North American Coordinator of Mayors for Peace, co-convener of United for Peace and Justice National Coalition, and she is the founding mother of the International Abolition 2000 Network.
Actual war victims
She's
like
been
myself.
an advocate and organizer for nuclear disarmament, for nonviolence, and environmental protection for 40 years. Her work encompasses local grassroots activism, including nonviolent direct action, advocacy, organizing, and networking at the national and international level. Jackie's research and analysis have been published in numerous articles and books. She's no slouch as an organizer. As part of her work with Mayors for Peace last month, she led the U.S. Conference of Mayors to adopt a resolution calling for urgent action to avoid nuclear war, resolve the Ukraine conflict, lower tensions with China, and redirect military spending to meet human needs. Jackie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joseph and Kevin, for inviting me. It's really an honor to be part of this distinguished panel. So I'll just fill in a few points about deterrence. The Latin root of the word deterrence means to frighten away, fill with fear, in other words, to threaten. Deterrence undergirds entire military industrial establishments and the national security states and elites they serve. It is an elastic ideology which has outlived its Cold War origins and is twisted and turned by nuclear-armed states to justify the perpetual possession and threatened use, including first use, of nuclear weapons. In the U.S., national security policy has been remarkably consistent in the post-World War II and post-Cold War eras.
They will not
nuclear deterrence, the threatened use of nuclear weapons, has been reaffirmed as the cornerstone of U.S. national security by every president, Republican or Democrat, since 1945,
even though I'm a war victim,
when President Harry Truman, a Democrat, oversaw the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Unfortunately,
look at this.
Russia and other would-be superpowers have increasingly fashioned their own national security policies
from
over the U.S.
Hiroshima,
model.
one of the
As described in a 2008 U.S. Department of Defense report, nuclear deterrence is achieved by credibly threatening a potential adversary with the use of nuclear weapons so as to prevent that adversary from taking actions against the United States, its allies, or its vital interests. This is accomplished primarily by maintaining sufficient and effective nuclear capabilities to pose unacceptable costs and risks upon the adversary.
They let me in,
should it
and
so
then as
act.
soon as I start to bring up these issues, they say,
this.
shut up.
Though our consistent goal has been to avoid actual weapons use, the nuclear deterrent is used every day by assuring friends and allies, dissuading opponents from seeking peer capabilities to the United States, deterring attacks on the United States and its allies from potential adversaries, and providing the potential to defeat adversaries if deterrence fails. In a 2021 article titled Forging 21st Century Strategic Deterrence, U.S. Navy Admiral Charles Richard, then Chief of U.S. Strategic Command, wrote, "We must acknowledge the foundational nature of our nation's strategic nuclear forces as they create the maneuver space for us to project conventional military power strategically." So you see, you can't just pluck nuclear weapons out of the equation. They play an integral role with
This is the
conventional
peace
weapons.
movement of the United States.
With Russian and
This is
Israeli
what they look
leadership's
like. They do
veiled
not
and
give a
not so
fuck.
veiled nuclear
I'm an
threats,
actual war
Russia
victim.
and Israel have
They're
both
just
been
pretend
using
like
their
it never
nuclear
happened.
deterrence in this
So
way
they never
so
have to
far.
make it right.
But it's undeniable that the longer these wars go on, the greater the threats of wider
You
regional
cannot trust
conflict
these
and the
people.
potential
You
for
cannot
nuclear
trust them.
escalation become. The Biden administration's October 2022
You cannot
nuclear
trust-
cost review doubled down
cannot
on the
trust these
centrality of nuclear deterrence in U.S.
Tell me I'm
national
wrong.
security policy, declaring,
You
quote, for
cannot
the
trust these
foreseeable
people.
future, nuclear weapons will continue to provide unique deterrence
Another
effects
old
that
white
no
lady
other element of US
gets to have the
military
mic.
power can
They
replace.
jammed in one Japanese
To
guy.
ensure
Then
that
it's a
these
parade of these
unique
white
deterrence effects are
academics
available for the indefinite future,
reliving the glory
the US is
days of
planning to
fucking being
spend
hippies in the
$2 trillion
60s and
over the next
70s,
30 years to maintain
fighting
and
against
modernize its nuclear
existential
triad,
threats
building new ballistic
while
missile
stepping on the
submarines,
communities
new silo-based
that were fucking
intercontinental
impacted
ballistic
by their
missiles,
war,
a new
which they
nuclear cruise
disregard.
missile, a modified gravity bomb, a new stealthy long-range strike bomber, and accompanying warheads for each delivery system with modified or new plutonium pits. Pits are the cores of hydrogen bombs. To give some perspective on the scale of this endeavor, at an April 2024 symposium, National Nuclear Security Administrator, that's NNSA, Jill Ruby stated, "The reestablishment of pit production capabilities is the largest and most complex infrastructure undertaking at the National Nuclear Security Agency
I did already.
since shortly after the Manhattan Project, and NNSA delivered over 200 modernized weapons to the Department of Defense this past year, the most since the end of the Cold War. If, God forbid, Trump becomes the next U.S. president, we can expect an even more aggressive nuclear deterrence stance. This is spelled out in Project 2025, a 900-page report by a coalition of over 100 far-right groups, led by the Heritage Foundation, widely seen as a playbook for a second Trump administration. And NATO is a nuclear alliance. As stated on its website, NATO continues to affirm the importance of nuclear deterrence in light of evolving challenges. The 2022 strategic concept states that NATO's deterrence and defense posture is based on an appropriate mix of nuclear, conventional, and missile defense capabilities, complemented by space and cyber capabilities. Again, I want to underscore the integral nature, the integration of nuclear weapons into these other weapons systems. So watch for reaffirmation of the centrality of nuclear deterrence in statements coming out of this week's NATO 75th Anniversary Summit in Washington, D.C. Over half the world's population lives in countries whose national security postures explicitly depend on nuclear weapons and the doctrine of nuclear deterrence. In my view, nuclear deterrence is the Gordian knot blocking the path to nuclear disarmament. It's daunting to acknowledge the entrenched power of the forces we're up against, and it's humbling to offer suggestions about what we can do to overcome them. I don't think we can succeed as a single issue movement. I don't think we can rely on celebrities or funders. I think we need to imagine new ways to make common cause with other constituencies based on shared values and vision. And I think we need to build a movement from the bottom up in order to create the political power
allies,
that will
including
allow
the
for change
disabilities,
at
the
the
second
top.
largest minority
I will
voting
briefly
bloc in the
introduce three
nation.
initiatives which
I'm
I
gonna tell the
believe
black
have the
people,
potential
right,
to
who've been
reach out
suffering from
broadly and
criminal
to build,
justice, right? Yeah,
to help build this
and I'm
kind
gonna
of
show
a
them this
movement, and I'll
disregard
be
that's
happy
going
to
on right the
elaborate
fuck
during
here,
Q&A.
and show them that they
Mayors for
cannot
Peace,
trust these
founded in
fucking people.
1982 by the mayors of Hiroshima and
Nuclear
Nagasaki,
disarmament.
is working for
I don't
a
want
world
nuclear
without
war
nuclear
either, but
weapons,
these people do
safe
not
and
give a fuck
resilient
about
cities,
us.
and a culture of
They're
peace.
more interested in,
And
shutting
served
you
as an
up and
executive advisor and
you
North
either
American
get in line
coordinator for
with their
Mayors for
fucking
Peace
priorities or shut the
since
fuck up.
2007. It was my privilege and pleasure to work with Mayor Akiba until he left office in
They
2011.
pretend like our suffering never
During Mayor
happened,
Akiba's tenure
and therefore they never
and the
have
2020
to
Vision campaign he
acknowledge us
led,
or
membership increased by tenfold to over 5,000
disgusting.
cities in 151 countries and territories. As of July 1st, 2024, membership has reached 8,403 cities in 166 countries
We
and
got over $1
territories.
million.
Our next membership goal is to reach 10,000 member cities as quickly as possible. But we also want to deepen the engagement of current members. Second, the Back from the Brink campaign is a U.S.-based grassroots coalition of individuals, organizations, and elected officials
Cannot trust these people.
working together toward a world free of nuclear weapons and a safer, more just future. Back from the Brink calls on the United States to lead a global effort to prevent nuclear war by actively pursuing a
talk about
verifiable
dead people in
agreement among
public
nuclear
housing.
armed states to eliminate their nuclear arsenals, renouncing the option of
You
using
see,
nuclear
they are
weapons
not
first,
addressing any of the dead
ending the
people,
sole
the
authority,
wrongfully
unchecked authority of any
incarcerated,
U.S.
the
president
fact
to
that I'm
launch
a
a
war
nuclear
victim.
attack,
How has this
taking
lady ever
U.S.
suffered from war? She
nuclear
has,
weapons off hair
but she's gonna
trigger,
shut me up.
alert, and canceling the plan to replace the entire
And
U.S.
Scott Ritter,
nuclear
okay.
arsenal with enhanced weapons. H-Res 77
A
in the
two-time
U.S. House of
convicted pedophile.
Representatives calls on the U.S. to adopt back from the brink's comprehensive policies prescriptions
There's
for
no
reducing
real
nuclear
energy as
risks
to
and
finding out
preventing
right
nuclear
now.
war,
Email me
and
tomorrow.
to embrace the goals and
Right, yeah.
provisions of
They'll
the
get
Treaty
to
on the
it when
Prohibition
they
of
have the
Nuclear
time.
Weapons.
I emailed them
There are
before.
currently 44
I showed it on the
co-sponsors.
screen.
Finally, the Poor
They're so
People's
full of shit.
Campaign, a national call for moral revival, is picking up the unfinished work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., addressing the interlocking injustices of systemic poverty,
Wow,
systemic
Jill
racism,
Stein, shut the
environmental
fuck up.
devastation, militarism in the war economy, and the
Jill
distorted
Stein's
moral
another one.
narrative
She's in
that
the
blames
top
poor
5% and
people
the
for
top
their own
1%.
poverty,
They're gonna
and
ban
weaving
me and
them
block me.
together into one
They're
moral
gonna ban me
fusion
and block me.
campaign, centering the voices of those most directly
Jill
impacted.
Stein is profiting off of
When
our
asked about the
It's
role of
fucking disgusting.
inspiration and intuition in his discoveries, Albert Einstein reportedly said,
7 generations.
"I am enough of the artist to draw freely upon my imagination. Imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world." Archbishop John Wester of Albuquerque, New Mexico, recently wrote, "Just as imagination enabled Einstein to see beyond the limits of scientific knowledge,
This is disgusting.
moral imagination can span the seemingly
They'd rather have a white hero like Jill
unbridgeable
Stein.
chasm
They
between the
don't
world
give a
as it
fuck
is
about the war victims.
and the world we so desperately need. By opening our
7
hearts to the
generations
power of love and
people
releasing
party.
our
They had
minds
this thing
from
called
the
Rage
chains of
Against the War
fear,
Machine.
it can make a world without
Supreme
nuclear
from
weapons
Wu-Tang
a
Clan
reality.
called out how that
To
event
achieve
was
the
bullshit.
elimination of nuclear weapons and a global society
I'm
that
telling you
is
right
more
now, this is
fair,
fucking so full
peaceful,
of
and
shit.
ecologically sustainable, we will need to move from the
That's okay.
irrational,
I'ma
fear-based
weaponize it
ideology
against
of
them.
deterrence to the rational fear of an eventual nuclear weapons use, whether by accident,
I'm already emailing
miscalculation,
every single
or
country
design.
in the
We will also need to
Asian
stimulate our
Africa
rational
about
hope
how
that security
the
can be
anti-war movement
redefined in
treats us.
humanitarian and ecologically sustainable terms
and I'm taking other
that will
powerful
lead to the
allies with me.
elimination of
So,
nuclear weapons
you know, I
and
know
dramatic
you think I ain't
demilitarization,
shit, but
freeing up tremendous resources desperately needed to address universal
they have
human
their
needs
great
and
white
protect
hope.
the environment.
And if you're
In
not
this
white,
time of multiple global crises, our work
They're-
for the elimination
if
of
you're
nuclear
bringing up real
weapons must
issues,
take place in a much broader framework,
this is
taking
fucking
into
garbage.
account the interface between nuclear and conventional weapons and militarism in general, the humanitarian and long-term environmental consequences of nuclear war, and the fundamental
I'm surprised they let me
incompatibility
in,
of
tell you the
nuclear
truth.
weapons with democracy, the rule of law, and human well-being. And my
I've
final
exposed
comment
all
will
of this
be
fucking
visual.
garbage.
Did you see that?
It's-
So-
yep.
This is us, okay? We need to disregard these guys
Look,
and
all
tell
the
our own
cavemen
truths.
are white.
Thank you.
All the victims are white.
Thank you very much, Jackie. That was really excellent.
It was
both
excellent,
analysis
Jackie.
and,
Great job,
and,
Jackie.
and recommendations. And simply to say, I found myself thinking of Ralph
Your
Ellison's
organization
book,
gets
The
over $1
Invisible
million.
Man. One of the seminal American novels, in which he says
Wow.
all roads lead to the golden day. Well, I don't know quite all roads, but I think what you've said kind of lays out the need to be engaging at multiple levels, different movements, to be joining as well as organizing, and to remember that ideas alone are not enough. We have to organize, organize, organize. So
Yeah.
with that, let me turn to introduce, excuse me, Emma Claire Foley. I'll get my identification up here. We have a second. Yeah, Emma Claire Foley joined Global Zero, its team, at New America in 2018. She now serves as Senior Associate for Policy and Research. She works on research relating to nuclear proliferation,
They provide
risk
jobs
reduction,
for their pretty.
and disarmament advocacy
Yeah, let me
efforts.
show you right here.
She monitors domestic and international policy developments.
I sent
Emma
them
Claire
emails
received her
before.
master's degree from Harvard University's Davis
Harvard
Center
University.
for
I'm
Russian
telling
and
you,
Eurasian
fucking shit is
Studies,
CIA.
and her bachelor degree in Russian,
How many emails have I
Eastern
sent to
European,
Peace Action? I've sent
and
a
Eurasian
bunch.
Studies and History
They're also on my
from the
mailing
University
list.
of Michigan. And I think she's also giving us a lesson here in commitment and steadfastness, as she's joining us well past midnight in Europe. Emma, the floor is yours.
Floor
Thanks
is
very
yours.
much.
Not for me.
So I think our other
Well, peaceful
panelists have
forgotten
really
nations.
covered well
I've had U.S.
pretty
presidential
extensive
candidate
critique
debates.
of the idea
They do
of
not fucking
deterrence
care.
as it appears in different ways in discourse around
Here's
nuclear
Scott Ritter
weapons.
again.
And I'm going to
Our platform
add just a
pedophiles over
couple
war
tiny
victims,
thoughts
but
to
why?
that, and then take more of the approach of the case study about how this language is applied today to one of the nuclear weapons
They had
programs
one
that's
Japanese
sort of on
guy,
the,
a victim of war,
on the top of
and then it's
everyone's
a
mind,
parade
the
of white
Sentinel
people.
program.
It's a parade of these white
which just
intellectual
yesterday
academics.
was recertified after revelations that it had
Can you
gone
imagine?
dramatically over budget. So I'll talk about that. But the first thing that I want to point out as I'm doing this is that
If
we're
you
when we talk about deterrence theory, this
if you
idea is
have peace with these
really
people,
baggy,
you will
right?
always
That
be
it's
on
not
their.
necessarily a theory in the
If
sense,
you dare to complain about
at least in
anything,
the sense that
dead
it's
people,
used, that has
fucking,
a
dead
clear
children,
articulation
pedophilia,
that can then be
right? Yeah.
applied
If
in,
you
in the
complain
way that
about
we might
fucking
think of
being excluded from
the
the
word
war
theory
movement,
implying.
if you
What
complain
it
about
really seems to mean
wrongful
is
incarceration,
anything that
they'll just shut
someone
you up.
in power who uses it wants it to mean, right? As we hear it over and over and over as a justification in arguments about nuclear weapons, it comes to carry more
You
and
better-
more weight
not just
and
nuclear
more
weapons.
and
You
more
better
meaning
invest in
until
all
it
the weapons,
becomes
biological
effectively
weapons,
meaningless,
everything.
right?
You cannot trust
And
these
so,
thoughts. I
kind
wish
of what I want to just
I don't
what I
really
want
like
to
it. I
demonstrate
wish
with
I don't
my
want this kind of
short
reality.
talk here is how
But
that
when the
works
anti-war
and
movement is
how
like this, you
one
cannot
of
trust
these
them.
actual programs
And that's the
really
anti-war
fails
movement.
to serve any aspect of what this word might mean. So to talk about the Sentinel program, this is
Either
a
get in line
program
or
that
shut the
would
fuck up.
modernize, as we call it, but effectively what that means
Cannot.
is replace
trust
intercontinental
these people.
ballistic missiles, the land-based nuclear missiles that are kept in underground silos in 5 states in the Great Plains. They've been there since the early 60s. And were initially placed there because of their ability to be shot over the North Pole right
They
into
can
the
never
Soviet
trust
Union. And they've had a really tremendous effect on the development of the states in which they're based. And I'll talk about that a little bit when I talk about the effects of the program. So they've been there for a long time. There's been a multi-year effort to modernize them as part of this comprehensive effort of so-called, again, modernization of the nuclear U.S. nuclear weapons arsenal, something that's happening across the globe. And at the time when this came up as a project, right, as a potential initiative, it was criticized by many of us here and many others as unnecessary and excessively expensive, right? And I want to linger on the unnecessary side rather than the excessively expensive
If
side,
you're
although
talking
that's
about
certainly
nuclear
true.
war deterrence, why aren't the Russians,
to
Ukrainians,
kind of tie this into arguments that
here,
have been made
right? Yeah.
tonight. We have land-based nuclear missiles that are kept in silos. That means their location is static and known, right? And so if we think of them as a force that can be used by the United States, they're also a potential
Not
target,
saying all
right?
white women
And
bad,
they're
'cause
a
they really
pretty
not.
good
There are
target
a lot
as
of white
targets
women
go,
that are actually good.
in that their
this,
location is
what's going on
publicly
right
known.
here,
It is on
this is
Wikipedia,
disgusting.
their precise coordinates, right? And you can visit these silos if you want, as I have.
That's great.
And so
Yeah,
what we
take a
have
little
here,
field trip.
right, and this has been covered in broad strokes by other
I'm not saying you don't get
speakers,
to be
but
part
is
of
a
the movement, but
situation
you
of
don't get to
profound
replace us.
vulnerability, right? And a situation where a president who's in theory making a decision about whether to use these tremendously powerful weapons has only a few minutes, right, to decide whether in fact to launch a strike with the information that they might have that a strike is coming in, right? So what this causes is a tremendous risk of a accidental first strike. And once you launch an ICBM attack, they cannot be recalled, which means that the risks associated with maintaining this force are very high. Numerous experts beyond this have argued that any conceivable need to be able to launch a nuclear strike could be met with other nuclear weapons. And yet, and this is a fact that you will see acknowledged pretty widely, right, within expert circles of all stripes. Certainly the experts shown in the cartoon we just saw, as well as
all they care about is their narrative.
something closer to what we have here today.
They don't
And
want
yet, when you look at the
exclusion
press
of war
release that
victims
came out just yesterday,
from this event,
all of your time and not mine, about the recertification of the Sentinel program, it does reference deterrence and the necessity of these weapons to, as it says, field a credible and effective deterrent. Right. So even among people for whom deterrence has a precise and credible, I guess I'll use the word meaning, these weapons have been shown to be extraneous somewhat, and yet, of course, they're lumped under this broad umbrella of deterrence because, as I've mentioned, right, it's an indicator of power rather than any actual significance of the or any actual future scenario that might be considered using these weapons. So this is a general sketch of the more how you might talk about these in terms of nuclear weapons strategy. There's a whole other world to talk about with their effect on the lives of the people who live and work around them, right? The program was sold as a uniquely effective economic impetus to the area in which it's based, which has been as well comprehensively disproven, right? Not only has it been shown that comparable investments in things like healthcare, education, green energy, all of which are desperately needed in these states, some of which are which are among the least populous in the United States, and suffer from huge shortages of things like rural healthcare, elder care, educational facilities across the board, really. So investing in any of these things would be much more effective for the long-term economic prosperity and just ability of the citizens of these states to thrive. And the funny thing is, when you look at when you talk to people in these states, as I have, there's an intense awareness of this, right? And many cities and states have already begun to effectively plan for disruption in the funding that does bring some economic impact when we talk about replacing this force, which has been based there, and around which major cities and Air Force bases in this area have grown and expanded. So we have essentially an argument that's made, right, for a program that is now 81% over its originally proposed budget. And as I said, right, talking about the cost impact of a program like this is not necessarily the most important thing, but it is certainly important to mention at a time when, basic human needs are comprehensively defunded, right? With the justification being a lack of funding, right? There seems to be an endless well of money to support programs like this. But on any other level, it's shown to be inadequate to serve any purpose it's been designated for, and yet it continues to persist under this label of deterrence, right? This great sort of circus tent covering up the actual situation. So I think I will wind down my remarks there. I wanted to add just like one focused example of how this word is used today. Yes, looking forward to people's questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. The Sentinel program and the land-based missiles, right? They're not only a sponge, but given their role as a sponge, they're among the most dangerous and likely sources of first strike warfare, in the sense of use them or lose them. And I think you've laid out quite clearly, the question about where real security lies. Does it lie in preparing for the end of life as we know it, or in providing medical care, housing, and everything else that we really need, real security? With that, I'm going to thank the panel and I'm going to hand
the
the
group cares.
coordination and sharing back to Kevin, and look forward
No one
to
in the
the
group
questions
cares.
and the dialogue that follows.
Thank you, Joseph, and thanks to all the panelists. And I love what Emma Claire said about deterrence means whatever someone in power wants it to mean. And I think that's exactly why we wanted to do this webinar, to address this topic. And I'm not sure if Mayor Akiba remembers this, but a few years ago, he and I were on a webinar sponsored by our sister Japanese peace group, Kensuiken. And at that time, we said, you know, we should do an event on debunking deterrence theory. So I'm so glad we're doing it today. Now, I really appreciate everyone who submitted questions beforehand. We got close to 100 questions. We won't be able to address them all tonight. That would
let's see if
eat
they
into
address
Emma
one of my
Claire's
questions.
sleep, and it would be lunchtime for Mayor Akiba by the time we got through all of them. But I will group together a few that I've reviewed and that I think are some of the most important questions.
Not mine.
So here are a few that are grouped,
Let's
I
see, what's
grouped
up, buddy?
together.
Go ahead.
Joe Scary asked, in today's mainstream discourse, where is the main place ordinary people absorb, and I think that's a good word for it, the quote-unquote gospel of deterrence? And then Cheryl Spencer asked, what would replace deterrence theory if we moved away from that? And Danny Hall asked, what are the most important arguments against deterrence that could be effective with members of Congress and their staff, and in communities where jobs are supported by the nuclear weapons industry? So those are a few that I grouped together, and be glad for any of the panelists to take a stab at answering any of those.
Oh, Susan Bush-Lachaki, what's up? U.S. presidential candidate Susan Bush-Lachaki.
Well,
Lahaki,
I would say to at least one of those, what might replace deterrence theory. I mean, I think what it would be replaced by would be a more realistic view of how
anti-war movement don't
the
give a
United
fuck
States
about
and other
us.
nuclear weapons countries wage war. We get this constant argument that nuclear weapons have been the sort of name brand war preventer, right? There's a graph that comes out a lot in congressional hearings where it says like war high, war low, right, before and after nuclear weapons, that many of you I'm sure have seen. But what we're also seeing today is nuclear weapon states waging war using conventional means, right, massive conventional means. And nuclear weapons are obviously a part of that at the rhetorical and sort of strategic level, right? As they're constantly mentioned and like used, in one of their main capacities as a threat. But it does give the lie to this idea that they're preventing war in some meaningful
If I
sense.
shout out Susan Bush-Lachaki, they may ban me.
I think that
They may ban me.
as I said a little bit in my talk, right, deterrence has become
I could shout out my allies here.
overused
that I
as a
work with.
concept to the point that, I can remember, right, like being in high school and like learning for the first time about nuclear weapons through like a debate team case, and seeing, how the logic kind of just means, right, like defense in
worth
some way.
nothing. What's worth is,
or
are you pleasing to the boss?
Presenting,
That's the key.
a
Are
sense
you
of yourself
pleasing
as
to the
able
boss?
to defend yourself in the most generic
That's what's
possible way.
important.
I think it's very possible that this idea could fade away from public discourse were it not constantly encouraged and constantly built up through a number of means. And I'll leave it to other panelists to talk about what those means are and anything else.
So again, anyone else want to address either how the public absorbs it, or what are good arguments with members of Congress and their staff or communities that are dependent on nuclear weapons spending? Those are tough. Jackie and then Elaine.
Yeah,
They do not care.
the American public and publics in some other countries as well have been
It's the
hammered
white guys at
with
the
the
top,
single message
the
that
white woman they brought in to
national
be with them,
security
the one
is,
Asian guy.
is
Yo,
ensured
mad
through
funny.
military, through
Yo, this is
overwhelming
exactly what the
military
shit
might.
it is, bro. And this Chinese guy
that
better have an accent. And
There's
this Japanese guy
no
better have an
cost that
accent.
would be too expensive for that.
If you were
And we
Asian
need a
American, you were a
paradigm
victim of
shift.
war, you better just
We
shut the
need a
fuck up.
paradigm shift, which is we have got to,
Fucking
and
disgusting.
we are at I think, an inflection
I'm
point
gonna send
in
this
history.
to every country of
I mean,
Asia
I
and
really do
Africa and
think
ask them to how
we
they
have
can
got
trust
to
you.
get ordinary people to
Go ahead.
reconceptualize security in terms of human security, the
I'm used
security
to
of
this.
individuals everywhere.
You think this is your first
regardless
time?
of
This
their
is my
country,
100th time.
regardless of their
I'm a
circumstances.
weaponized.
And
Your
that
disregard
requires a
against
whole
you. I'm a
different
fucking
set
weaponized
of
it.
security mechanisms. Now
You
that
are
can also
predictable
be
in your actions.
approached
That
hand in hand
means
with common security,
gonna
which
be
is
hard to
something
fucking
Joseph
beat
works
these
on a
fucks.
lot, where you get countries to agree to, they might not like each other, but they might agree to recognize
They
that
might
they're-
agree.
they're-
No, never.
they
Not
have
while you
mutual
fucking cut us
interests,
off.
which are
Not while you refuse
threatened
to acknowledge
if
our
they're
issues.
at war with each other. And I
Not while
think
you
that
fucking install your girlfriends
there
into paid
needs to be
positions
a kind
while
of
we starve and get nothing.
bottom-up
Are you fucking
realization
crazy?
of this and a demand for this new kind of security paradigm. And I do see that
Yeah,
coming
secure for
partly
you, not for me.
through the
Secure for you.
some of the
not for me.
campaigns that I mentioned. As I said, the Marriage of Peace is not single issue
You'll
now.
get
Yes, it's
to be
calling
heard.
for the global elimination of
But
nuclear
me?
weapons, but also promoting safe and
I'll
resilient
be
cities and a
silenced.
culture of peace
Y'all
in
mad
which
funny.
peace is a priority for every
Y'all full of
individual. That's
shit.
part of how we get there. The Poor People's Campaign is a total moral fusion.
Oh my
campaign.
God, does it say poor
They're
people? Shut the
gonna
fuck
be
up.
Now launching a 4-month effort to reach 15 million
Did you say
poor and
poor? Shut
low-wage
the fuck
infrequent
up.
voters ahead of this year's election.
You're not poor like me.
And they
Shut
have
up, bitch.
17
You're
points.
not poor like me.
And I'll just read a few of
not
them
poor
because I
like me.
think
Shut
these all
the
go
fuck
together.
up.
First of all, abolishing
You're not
poverty
poor
is
like
the
me.
4th leading cause of death in the United
You get
States.
to be somebody.
A living minimum wage, at least $15 an hour. Voter rights,
Poor
health care, affordable adequate
They
housing,
use the word poor.
an end to gun violence,
Who's working with
fully
the poor?
protected
That's
women's
me.
rights,
Who's working with the
environmental
disabled?
justice,
That's me.
secures clean
Who's
air and
working with
water,
people that's been in
justice
prison
for all indigenous
decades?
nations, fully
That's
funded
me.
public education,
What about you?
just immigration laws,
You having a little
and
cushy get together
addressing
with your
militarism in the
fucking
war
cushy ass
economy,
white academic elites.
standing for peace, not
You know what I
war,
mean? Your
an immediate
international flavor with
ceasefire
a
in
$1 million
Gaza that
fucking
allows
organization.
humanitarian relief,
While they're telling
the
me
release
as a
of
war
all
victim to shut
hostages
the
and
fuck
peace
up.
with justice
Yo, you mad
to be
funny.
pursued, and an end to genocide around the world. Now that's a pretty comprehensive agenda, but it's all there.
Comprehensive
and so
from a
any
white
of us
person's
who are working on
perspective and
any of those
priorities.
issues, I think, should jump in and lend a hand in on this voter outreach, because they have done a study showing that if these low propensity, low income low propensity meaning people who don't vote very often, were motivated to vote, that it could change the outcomes of the elections.
Thanks, Jackie. Elaine wanted to address this, and then I have a question for Tad.
Yeah, I think that Congress and other people who are used to using this word, deterrence, ought to have to address the concerns of people who have worked at the heart of the nuclear architecture and who have critiqued it in the way that Lee Butler has, but also in the way that William Perry has, and Kissinger, and McNamara. They need to come to terms with what it means that people at the very heart of defense have themselves acknowledged that they made a terrible mistake by participating in this, and just go through and say, well, what is the reputation? People who think a lot about deterrence theory do think it has a very specific meaning of preventing all conflict by making the cost so high for any participant that they wouldn't dare initiate something. But I think the point is very important, that it's a term that's intentionally obscure. People don't quite understand what it means. It has something to do with defense, and yet it's defense that involves being willing to kill millions of people. It's like the kind of double talk that we hear about from Orwell's 1984. You have something called a peacekeeper missile that is actually designed to obliterate lives. And you keep going in circles. We keep going in circles saying the point of our missiles is we have them so we won't use them, which is just almost speaking nonsense. If you don't want to use them, then give them up, and that's the best way to not use them. In answer to the question of where does the public dovetail from Joe, Lee Butler says that private conscience, individual conscience, is going to be very important in returning to a world that doesn't rely on deterrence. And you can see right now that many good people really believe that nuclear weapons have kept us safe. One strategist, the one I mentioned earlier, Thomas Schelling, in his Nobel Prize-winning speech, said that maybe the greatest event in the 20th century is that a nuclear weapon wasn't used. And you often hear people saying the nuclear weapon hasn't been used. And what they don't add is, had it been used, we would not be having a conversation. We would be crawling along on an earth covered with ashes. So it's not just a casual, question of whether we have or don't have the use of nuclear weapons.
As well as public ignorance of all the near misses when an accident, a miscalculation could have brought life to an end on Earth. I was born just after the Cuban Missile Crisis, November of 1962, and my mother thought I was never going to be born. So I have a question for Tad, but this is something that Joseph and Jackie and I know, have also worked on a lot, which is Asian security, and particularly the questions of security vis-a-vis North Korea and China. And one of the questions, and I'm grouping a few questions here. One of the questions was, well, North Korea is sometimes cited as a successful example of deterrence. And I'm not sure what they meant by that North Korea, because they have nuclear weapons, deters others from attacking, or North Korea is deterred from attacking by the United States nuclear weapons, and Japan and South Korea being under the nuclear umbrella. There's different ways you could look at that. But then also the question of China, because China has always had in the past a minimal deterrent, but is now moving to something that looks like it will be enhanced more than a minimal deterrent. And I wanted to ask Mayor Kiva to take the first shot at answering those questions, which are difficult ones, I admit.
Okay, let me tell you first what's going on in Japan. Okay, and then that perspective, living within Japan, is quite different from the sort of frame in which the question was posed. Okay, in Japan, whenever North Korea tests a missile or rocket or whatever, okay, your iPhone will ring loudly and just declaring danger and danger. And in this case, that's the public television tells you to find a shelter, hide in a concrete building or go to some place that's safe, because North Korea has just launched a rocket.
There is no safe shelter.
Okay, that's the threat. And I don't think that it's such a great threat either, because Japan also launches rockets, not on a daily basis, but certainly yearly basis, some of which actually fail. But anyway, under those circumstances, and Emma was right by saying that deterrence means whatever those in power want to mean. And so their argument goes in both ways. So, some of the people who uphold deterrence as the ultimate policy that Japan should take, and actually starts arguing, do you think that the United States will really protect Japan from North Korea by attacking North Korea with nuclear weapons? And then they advance, no, the United States will not take that risk. Okay, then the proponents of Japan's nuclear arsenal promoter, they then say, okay, that's why we, Japan, should possess nuclear weapons. Okay, but they don't want to throw away the so-called nuclear umbrella because we need protection when Russia attacks Japan. But then the same argument can be repeated, but then the conclusion is that Japan should possess nuclear weapons. However, that when you look at that kind of action, or strong voices, or opinion forging within Japan, when you look at that from the Chinese
primarily
side,
white panel
it'll
with their one
give
Asian
a
guest.
completely different message.
Yo, this is so fucking
Because
stupid,
as I
man.
said,
This is
that
amazing.
Abe and even Kishida administration are opposed to
Fucking
the
amazing.
policy of no first use. In other words, if Japan possesses nuclear weapons, that means Japan's attitude is that Japan will take the first strike policy.
Yeah.
Now, China has, since it has possessed nuclear weapons, Chinese policy has been no first use. Now, faced with that, from
That's
China's
no more
point of
victim
view,
over here.
which does not want to use nuclear weapons first, then faced with the Japanese attitude that Japan is going to, just to take
You're
up
only allowed to blow up in this country if
nuclear
you're from
policy
Asia. If you're
with
Asian
the
American,
first
you ain't
strike
shit. Jet Li,
policy
Jackie Chan, that's
at
it.
its foreground.
You not if
Now,
you
that's
if
a
you born here,
confrontation,
you ain't
and,
nothing.
Many Chinese still believe
Never.
that Japan has not atoned its
Never.
crimes and sins.
If you born here, you
in
ain't worth nothing.
World War II and
If you
in the
Asian.
30s and 40s and so forth. So, given that situation, China fears Japan possessing nuclear weapons, and that increases tension
They'll find some
extremely.
Asian from Asia.
And so easing
from
that
Asia.
actually
They don't want us to
should
really be
be
Americans. That's the
initiated by
thing.
Japan.
We're
For
not
example,
real
Japan
Americans
does
to
not
them.
have any diplomatic relations with North Korea, which is just across the sea from Japan. And that's ridiculous. No matter what happens, the first thing that Japan should be doing,
Right, I know.
making an effort, is to at least have a diplomatic ties with North Korea. Well, recognize, just each other, and it is Japan that should take the initiative. And that kind of diplomatic actions lacking, talking about possessing nuclear, weapons on its own, is extremely, dangerous, and that's the most destabilizing factor in Northeast Asia, I think. Okay, despite the fact that there has been a civilian effort to forge the Northeast Asia nuclear weapons free zone with the idea of 3+3, that is Korea, Japan, and the United States as the three sort of core countries, with surrounding Russia, North Korea, and China as the surrounding countries, and forging a six-country treaty to stabilize the situation and making that area nuclear weapons free. And I think it's a great idea, but the reality is so far away from its objective and idealistic sort of ideas that the civil society has been advancing.
Well, I nominate you to be the first Japanese ambassador to North Korea. So I don't know how busy you are these days, but you'd be the man for the job. I'm going to ask a question because this has come up, I know, in some of the work that is happening in Congress that I monitor and others do too. This is from the Q&A. What effects might the further use of AI, artificial intelligence, have on our safety from nuclear accidents and nuclear attacks, including attacks launched in response to a non-existent first strike? Which is just a brave new world question that makes my brain hurt, but I know it is on people's minds. And there are efforts in Congress, and I don't know the current status of it, but to ensure that there couldn't be a robot-generated nuclear war, that AI could not start a nuclear war. Does anybody else have more information or intelligence on that?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
We're probably going to get voted right
My
now.
mentor
Let's get ourselves
is
voted.
Joseph
Fuck it.
Weizenbaum, who created the program, first AI program called ELIZA, which mimicked the psychoanalyst and actually became a sensation at the time in the 1960s. But he warned that the AI will take a position that we human beings should not allow the machine and computer and software to assume. So he said that there should be a clear distinction between humans and machines. And there are things that human beings should not let machines, computers, AIs do, even if they are capable of doing. And one thing that AI could easily do is to replace human decision making, but without any accountability. Okay, just in this presentation, I try to press the point that there is a person responsible for starting a nuclear war. That's a moral responsibility. And although it's a wrong decision to press the button, that under the current situation, we'll still have the capability of who actually does that. Okay, the US president, the Russian president, or other people who have the authority to press the button. But in the AI age, it is possible that the entire decision is relegated to AI and nobody knows who actually made the decision. AI is so complicated, and you just don't know what's going on behind the scene. So there could be a network which nobody knows of AI to AI behind the scenes. So, you know, two countries collaborating under carpet where nobody really knows. So who actually pushed the button could never be known. And of course, you know, when the entire humanity is gone, nobody cares actually who did it. But still, I believe it matters for all of us, for all our survival, to hold people accountable for their actions and for a grave consequence like human extinction. I think we should build a system. We should keep the system so that the accountability still means something. The moral decision still means something for human beings. So conceding important parts of military decisions, political decisions, and other decisions that human beings, you know, have cherished, you know, actually giving that up to AI is something we should never do, and the world should, you know, cooperate with each other to make sure that there is transparency, you know, about who is making a decision to give that human power to computers. Right now,
we did this with Ian
the
Carpenter,
private corporations who are
the word
working for
diversity
profit are
into,
creating
AI,
programs which
and
are
it won't show you an
convenient
Asian
and they're
American.
selling
It
to
won't show you an Asian
everybody.
American.
And people, you know, because they're cheap, are buying them, utilizing
You don't
them,
need Asians to be
but
diverse.
you don't really know what you're buying. You may be, you know, brought into the world, you know, where decisions you think you've made was actually made by someone else. You are simply a puppet in that whole machine. So the entire world should be aware that the AI has that danger, and we should really build up a you know, clear political system and moral system to address that issue. Anyway, Joseph Weisman wrote a book, Computer Power and Human Reason, in 1976, and I recommend that you read it. Because it's a classic, but it addresses the point I'm trying to explain to you more eloquently and more precisely.
I hadn't even thought of AI systems in one country and another country communicating with each other to start a war. So now you've actually made me more worried. But Peace Action and other organizations will keep everybody apprised of efforts in Congress to make sure that that can't happen. One of the questions that I really resonated with that came in early was questions about the notion of patriarchal systems of power that certainly relate to the war system, to nuclear weapons, to deterrence.
You got 3 women, 3 men.
And I
bro,
wonder, and I guess the
element.
question for me is that something that we under promote? Because I mean, if you look at Pete's Action, most of our ardent supporters are women. And
women are
men who
included.
might consider themselves feminist and who are against the patriarchal system of power. And I guess I don't know that it needs to be so much analyzed, but is that something in terms of our organizing that we don't emphasize enough, that nuclear weapons, the war system, and notions like deterrence are undergirded by patriarchal notions of power?
Oh my God.
Elaine?
There's a lot of
Yeah,
white
I
women
think
speaking.
that is a very interesting idea to contemplate.
Sure you do.
I've always been mystified by why the feminist movement has not given more attention to what is almost an all-male creation. The nuclear arsenal is almost an all-male creation, and it may well be. I think that really is an important question to ask, and one that we shouldn't necessarily jump into, but we should deliberate about and see whether that would be a promising idea. It might be able to awaken people who aren't at present worried about or don't see it as their responsibility to worry, and it might actually make them feel connected to it, to recognize the kind of, all male thinking in this aggressive framework.
Anyone else want to go ahead, Jackie?
Yeah, I have a lot of difficulty with this one, because you have to be very careful in distinguishing between people of different genders and a feminist philosophy or foreign policy. And I am constantly distressed by the growing numbers of women who in fact are in horrible warmongering positions. A lot of the nuclear weapons establishment now is led by women. Jill Ruby, who I quoted, the National Nuclear Security Administration person, is a woman, and very hawkish. You mentioned Theresa May. I mean, we've had lots of examples come up, and so I think it needs to be thought through in a careful and thoughtful way. Because if you just pit it as a gender-based thing, it doesn't get us anywhere.
I agree with that, and that's why I think you're talking about systems of power, and
yeah.
that's how you frame it. And Elaine's right; these were creations for the most part of men, but that doesn't mean that if you doesn't mean if you put women in. Yeah, there's a lot of undersecretary of this, that, or the other thing in the Pentagon now. All right, we are going to be closing very soon. Oh, Tad, did you want to answer that too?
Yeah, just on that subject, that reminded me of Dr. Helen Caldicott's writing. She wrote a book, precisely on that point. Just all these missiles, nuclear weapons, and everything else as a phallic symbol. And I think maybe we should go back to the classic to start our thinking, rethinking of the subject.
Okay. The last thing I wanted to ask about was concrete examples, and Jackie had mentioned some earlier, and the mayor had talked about upcoming next year
Marianne
anniversaries
Williamson.
of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of campaigns that can move us forward, if not specifically to debunk deterrence theory, then to move towards disarmament. And so we talked about Sentinel a bit, and that the demand really is not just to cancel Sentinel, but to get rid of the land-based ICBM, that leg of the nuclear triad. If anyone wants to offer any comments about those kinds of things as we are wrapping up, that would be most welcome.
I already did.
Yes, you did.
Horrible.
Thank you.
That's disgusting.
Okay. Well, if there's nothing else on that specific.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Again, let me report on the Japanese situation. The most of the Japanese local governments, I mentioned that Hiroshima City's peace policy being dominated by the foreign ministry officials. However, that's not limited to Hiroshima. Most of the heads of local governments in Japan are the retired top-level high
fucking Marianne
government
Williamson, one fucking
officials
bougie white
from
millionaire
from Tokyo.
Those are the only
So
ones that they really want.
the local
I'm telling you,
government's
all the countries, the
policies
rest of
to
the
a
world.
large extent are just an extension of the national
The only
government's
answer
policy,
can come from
and
woke
that has been
ideology.
going on. And in the recent Tokyo election, the incumbent governor Koike won, but she was backed by the Liberal Democrats, which is the dominant party. Now, we need to change this political situation in Japan to change the Japanese government's nuclear policy. Okay, and no one else can actually do it. Well,
you cannot trust these people.
Actually, you can.
Cannot trust
The
these
Japan has been known to be sensitive to pressures from foreign countries, not just governments, but people saying good things and bad things about Japan from abroad. The Japanese public, has been quite sensitive to that. So if you pay a little bit more attention to what's going on in Japan and voice your opinion, just in one way or the other, I believe that will help our efforts toward democratizing Japanese politics, and especially that in local governments, and especially the government in Hiroshima, to sort of bring our ideal into reality by formulating a 2040 vision, which I'm calling, and I'm hoping that something like that will be created by August 6th next year, so that we will know that the future generation will be on the right path. So anyway, I need your help in that regard.
And we will do so. And of course, many of us have worked closely with the Japanese Peace Group over the decades. Before we wrap up, I want to say thanks to Jeff Jurgens from the Peace Action staff, our communications director, who did such a great job helping to promote this event, and on the tech side, to the 31 organizations
I've written
that helped to co-sponsor, and we hope to replicate this in the future. Joseph, is there anything you would like to say to help close us out tonight?
I guess two things. I mean, the one piece is organize.
I'm organizing.
That analysis is necessary.
If you
but
organize,
without
but you do not organize
organization
within
and
this
social
white
movement,
framework,
it doesn't change policy.
Why is there no black
And we've
people
got to
here?
be focused on changing policy so that we can prevent nuclear cataclysm. I guess the other is that I'm looking forward to having the recordings of this webinar, which we can circulate not only to all those who participated, but certainly to our co-sponsors. And in terms of education and organizing, what better thing to do than to invite friends or have your local organization take a look at this webinar together, have a conversation, and think about what you can and should do next. So that's my response. And just to thank all of our speakers, and I think I want to send a special thank you to Mayor Akiba, who among other things has maybe helped our audience and our movement understand that the peace constitution in Japan
Not an Asian
is
American, though, but
ignored
we have an
by its
Asian.
government.
We're set. We're good. We're not racist.
That if we're going to move forward, it's going to take international cooperation between our movements in the United States and Asia and
don't trust them
Europe
now.
and the global South.
This guy's talking about fucking missiles being
organize,
oh,
defeat Sentinel, and work for
what
peace
about the
and
disregard
justice
for the
and
actual
climate together.
cultural? What about the cucking?
Thank you, everyone, and particularly to our panelists. You were all fabulous, and this couldn't have gone better in my little half-baked idea of how this event would go. So much better. Thank you all so much. Emma Claire, really, I hope you get to sleep soon. Bye-bye, everybody.
They're not going to say nothing. Goodbye. Kick me out the call. Go ahead. It's over. Yeah? I can't even believe this shit. I can't believe it.